Back to our top story now. Apartheid police killed activist Neil Aggett. That's the finding by Judge Motsamai Makume in the reopened inquest into Aggett's death while in police detention. 40 years later, and the initial inquest, which ruled his death as suicide, has been overturned. Well, let's discuss this further then. I'm joined by Yasmin Sooka of the Foundation for Human Rights. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining me, ma'am. So your initial reaction to this, hardly surprising, is it? I mean, no one really believed that Neil Aggett committed suicide.
Thank you, Chilisizwe. I think that the ruling by Judge Makume is certainly a vindication of the right to the truth about what happened to Neil Aggett, particularly for the Aggett family and, of course, for the families of many other detainees who died at the hands of the security branch. And while we are yet to receive the written ruling, I think all of us were deeply impressed by the way Judge Makume meticulously went through the evidence of the previous inquest and then proceeded to work through the evidence that came to be heard at the reopened inquest. And he made a really scathing finding about the magistrate who presided over the first inquest, saying that he'd obviously been biased in not looking into the discrepancies that emerged in the evidence and also not taking into account the evidence of other detainees who had testified. And the judge went through all of the detainees' evidence that they had given at the first inquest and then at the second one. He also paid special tribute to people like Frank Dutton, who died earlier this year. And in fact, he ruled that obviously Neil Aggett's death was a cover-up by the security branch and that in fact he had been killed by members of the security branch. He disproved the version of the security branch that Neil Aggett had committed suicide by hanging himself. And based on the evidence of Dr. Stephen Knight, he found that, the 62 hours of interrogation had rendered Neil Aggett unconscious and completely unlikely to be able to, hang himself on that grill. He just said that Neil wouldn't have had either the strength or the capacity to do so. And I think this, while we all knew that this is what happened in detention, we knew what the security branch was responsible for. I think it's absolutely wonderful when you have a court, a judicial verdict actually saying this. And this is really important for the family, but also for the families of other detainees. But the big question is, he went through the evidence of all the security branch members who are still alive, and he noted that they should be investigated. Yeah. And so that's really the next step, I think, what's going to follow.
You're absolutely right, ma'am, because my next question to you would be, as important as that aspect of getting the answers to questions that have lingered, especially among family members for no less than 40 years, about 40 years thereabout, what are the consequences that you expect will follow from this? Or should I phrase it, what are the consequences that should follow from this finding of this inquest?
Well, obviously, as the legal team, one needs to work through the judgment quite carefully, particularly when it deals with the different versions that emerged of the security branch testimony. And then, of course, we need to consult with the family members on what they would see as next steps. But his recommendation was that the NPA needs to carry out investigations. And I would assume that that would be with a view to prosecution. We have a number of security branch members where he painstakingly took apart their evidence and he set about all the discrepancies. And these include people like, Nicholas Dietlefs, Mr. Swanepoel, Mr. Visser, Mr. Chauke. And I would argue that there's a time period that we are asking the NPA to do its work in and the Hawks, and that we should then move swiftly to a resolution of this matter because, this is a battle against time. And also many of these people always claim that they don't remember. And that is why it's quite critical that we move quite quickly. But it's really given hope to the many families of victims who died during the apartheid period. And I think that's why this case has been so symbolically important as well.
And you say that the judge went through an assessment of the various security branch members who are still alive, who would have been involved at least in the interrogation and possibly in the killing of Niel Aggett. Just from your assessment, how viable a case would still there be, you know, in terms of those who are still alive? I mean, how many, do you have an idea of how many, even if it's not a specific number, but do we still have people that can be pursued in a criminal process today?
I think so. You know, there are almost two parts to it, because on the one part, the judge has found that the security branch was responsible for his killing, right? And so there would be a question of those security branch members who were alive and who may be implicated, you know, in the interrogation and the torture, and then by extension to having been involved in his killing. And then, of course, they're all the ones who have been involved in the cover-up. And I would say that there are probably around 6 of them whose names we have, who the Hawk should pursue with a view to investigation. I think the judge also, I think, was very clear about the role that was played by, you know, Stephen Whitehead, who was the key interrogator and who was deeply angry by the fact that Niel made an official complaint about his interrogation and torture. And it's his belief that it was following that complaint that, in fact, Niel was subjected to this inhuman interrogation. He also raised the name of, you know, Arthur Conright, who was also one of those people who were in command. And it's a pity that the two of them are not alive. But, you know, again, this points to the fact that Stephen Whitehead was alive at the time when the family first approached the NPA. And had the inquest been reopened at that point, it would have been possible to compel him to testify. Today, he's no longer around, but the remaining interrogators are around, and we should certainly pursue them.
Lastly, Yasmin Sooka, what is the importance of processes such as these? The Neil Aggett inquest reopened, the Ahmed Timol inquest reopened as well, the processes around the COSAS 4, Nokuthula Simelane, etc. To the extent that there would be someone who would be questioning whether this is victor's retributive justice or a vindication of our truth and reconciliation process, which didn't mean impunity to start off with and had certain prescripts in terms of the law of what was supposed to happen to those who failed to come out with the truth and seek reconciliation and seek pardons and the likes. You served in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. What would be your argument to someone who perhaps holds the view that this is a form of victor's retribution as opposed to the path we all agreed on of reconciliation?
Thank you so much for that question. I think it's so critical because, you know, in our country, you know, part of the compromise during the period of the interim constitution was that perpetrators would be able to apply for amnesty, and provided they made full disclosure, and they could prove that they had done this in pursuit of the objectives of the state or the liberation movements, they would receive an amnesty. Now, amnesties are controversial because you should never allow amnesties for what we call serious international crimes. And bearing in mind that apartheid was declared a crime against humanity, in fact, most of these cases are not ordinary murders, but they're really murders under the international crime of you know, apartheid. Now, why is it important to pursue them? It's because the law made very clear that because you were given this very generous opportunity, if you did not apply or if you did not make full disclosure and you were refused amnesty, then the law would follow its course. And that is why when the Commission completed its work, it recommended that the state adopt a bold prosecution policy in line with the law setting up the Truth Commission. And it also handed over a list of 300 cases to the NPA with a view that it should investigate with the purpose of prosecution. Now, it has taken us 23 years. And in fact, we only have these few cases that are in the courts. And they are only in the courts because the families of victims have chosen to place the NPA and the state on terms. And in fact, in the Ahmed Timol case and the Nokatula Samalani case, we in fact had the court confirm that in fact the state, the democratic state, had deliberately suppressed the investigation and prosecutions, and that furthermore, there had been a moratorium on investigating these cases at the level of the Hawks and the NPA as far back as 2003. Now, this is a denial of the rights of victims, but it's also a denial of the systemic issues which our country is facing, which is at the level of the state, many institutions have been captured. And part of that is because of the impunity that exists not only around the TRC cases, but it's also given rise to the impunity around the arms deal, the case of Marikana, the Life SCD many cases. And so to restore the rule of law in our country, it's really important that at an individual level, the families of victims are able to have the truth acknowledged and to have closure. But for our society, this is imperative for institutional reform.
All right, I've got to thank you for your time and those powerful insights that you've shared with me this afternoon. That's Yasmin Sooka there from the Foundation for Human Rights, weighing in on the latest outcomes, the outcome coming from the second inquest into the death of Niel Aggett in detention in 1982.